Peace, y'all. It's your Real Roots man in Japan. I'm back with another video. It's been a minute since I've done one of these, and yeah, I appreciate y'all being patient with me with these videos. You know, I'm trying to find the right rhythm, just really the right way to make these videos, you know what I mean? Because I really want to bring y'all something worth watching, or at least worth listening to, at the very least, you know? So yeah, today I just want to give an update, really just life update in Japan as a black man, as a roots man. You know, yeah, it's been 4 years. It has been 4 years since I've been in Japan. And I'm 39 now. I came to Japan when I was 35. I feel like that says a lot about my journey in general. And I think a lot of people who come to Japan, you know, move to Japan, not to visit, because visiting and moving are two very different things. People who move to Japan, at least people I've met out here, have generally come in their early 20s, perhaps late teens. But in general cases, at least in my journey, meeting other brothers, other people in general, right, have come to Japan when they're basically in their early 20s, mid 20s, young adults. And I think that's one of the things that's made me stand apart in general, because coming to Japan in my mid 30s is definitely different than coming to Japan in my mid 20s. I had already studied a bit about Japan, learned a bit about Japan, started to learn the language a bit, and then I moved over. So I had some preconceived ideas about Japan, so it wasn't really like a blank slate, if you will. But, you know, I would say I came with a certain level of maturity that I think a lot of people don't come with. That being said, I think that influenced my experience. Now, I will say my experience as a black man in Japan has been mostly positive. I've had good connections with people. I've made good friends, not only with Japanese, but with other international folks. And I like to keep my friend circle diverse in general, you know, especially when I was back in the States. I like to be in community with different types of folks with different backgrounds, ethnicities, and whatnot, because I think ultimately that makes you a more well-rounded person, a more global person. And I like to consider myself a world citizen, a global citizen. Although I was born and raised in the States, you know, my roots are in Haiti, where my family's from. And anybody who's been paying attention to what's going on over there, it's a little crazy, but it's complicated, it's political, it's historical. There's a lot going on with that. Maybe I'll delve into that in another video. But that being said, I've always had a global cultural perspective on life, on my travels, but also understanding that the dynamics of being black, having this skin tone that we call black, you know what I mean? Which in itself is a social construct, just as white is. But nonetheless, that is the way that society at large perceives somebody like me. You know, Japan's no different in that regard. But in my experience, I feel like being in Japan has allowed me to be more human, or feel more human in some ways, and less just being a black man, if that makes sense. If anybody can relate to that, please let me know in the comments if you know what I mean by that. If you've traveled outside of the US. And, you know, I found that black people in Japan are more of a mystery than a known people, if that makes sense. Like, I think a lot of what they perceive about us is through the media, and now through social media. And, you know, the good and the bad, the positive and the negative. But I find that the Japanese tend to be more curious about black people than anything else. Now, of course, anywhere you go, I think just being different, standing out, especially as a black man, you're gonna receive a certain level of attention. Sometimes that attention can feel good. Sometimes that the attention can feel bad. Sometimes you don't wanna stand out. And sometimes you do. All depends on your personality, depends on who you are. For me, you know, in the 4 years I've been here, it's taught me that most times people just don't know. They just don't know. And it's my job to inform them about who I am, where I'm from, what I'm about, what I represent. It's always my goal and my intention to put my best foot forward in whatever that I do and with whoever I meet. And I've found that that's created a lot of beautiful connections, just being open and not judging how people perceive you without knowing who they are first as well. And, you know, overwhelmingly, my interactions with Japanese, like I said before, has been positive. And I think the negative instances have been more related to misunderstandings, perhaps some language barriers. That being said, I haven't really experienced what I've heard some other, you know, black people experience in terms of people not wanting to sit next to you on the train, or people just randomly touching your hair, you know, things like that. And what's interesting is that a lot of times people approach me speaking Japanese, which I find really interesting, you know, versus speaking English. And, you know, obviously they're surprised when I speak Japanese back, and appreciative. I made a different video about dating in Japan, what that's like, and I'll make a separate video, a part 2 to that video as an update. Because since I made that original video, if you want to check it out, you can. I've moved to Tokyo. I live in the city, but I live kind of in the suburbs of the city. I live in a smaller town or smaller area, or less busy area that's more green. As you can see, I'm in the park right now. It's very quiet, it's very peaceful. And that's really my vibe, you know. I love nature, I love being in nature. So that's why I chose to stay in this area as opposed to the center of the city or busier areas. Now, I feel like being in Japan and experiencing the culture to the extent that I have has influenced me profoundly as a human being first. And also as a black man, as a Haitian man, Haitian American man, it's also influenced me to dig deeper into my own culture and my own roots, which is something that I started back in the States anyway, when I really started to dig into, history, particularly African American history, African history, and seeing the connections that we have throughout the world, both culturally, historically, anthropologically, I hope I'm saying that right, and just roots. So I feel like my experience as a black man in Japan is no different than I feel my experience anywhere in the world where we don't have large numbers. Now, my experience as a black man as compared to the States is vastly different here in Japan. And it's different in the sense that I feel less attacked for simply being black or perceived in a negative light. Now, of course, that's not always the case. I feel like the majority of people in America are good people, people who want to live together and know each other better and have better communities. But we're still figuring out how to best do that. It's a process, especially when that's not encouraged in general. And in Japan, it just feels like people just have a lack of knowledge about black people in general, past their contributions to music, let's say hip hop, jazz, and to a lesser degree, films. Hollywood films definitely come out here. They usually come out a little bit later, but they consume a lot of the same type of films that we consume in the States. Except I feel like not all the films filter through. Just depends on the film. But generally, the big Hollywood blockbuster films come out here as well. Like I saw Sinners for the first time in Japan. And, I think people's understanding of that film out here is mixed, because I think that film is a deeply American film. And unless you know the history of America and the various interactions that we've had in America, you might not fully understand that film coming from outside of America. But nonetheless, I found that a lot of people appreciated that film still. And which I found, quite interesting because ultimately it's about human connection, right? It's about piercing through identities and going to the soul of the human being. And I think that's what Japan has done for me. It's taught me that ultimately we're all human beings having a human experience. And, things are put on top of that human experience that can connect us or divide us. And it's really up to us as every individual to demystify who we are, who our people are, where we come from. Being black in Japan can be a beautiful thing depending on the perceptions that you come with, the preconceived notions. I really feel like when you come to Japan as a black man or a black woman or as black people in general, I think you really have to put aside any trauma as much as possible that you're carrying with you from the West and understand that people's knowledge of us here is limited. And they might say or do some things that may seem offensive on the outside, but oftentimes, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, in my observation, in my opinion, it's not coming from a divisive or a bad place. It's usually coming from a place of ignorance and just not knowing. I think the best thing you can do, and what I've done, is just to have as much of an open mind as possible. And just be good to people, be kind, be courteous, learn their language as much as possible, because I think the best way you can get to a person's heart that doesn't speak your language, other than by your actions of kindness, is through their language. So even knowing the basics of their language and the cultural norms and what's considered respectful, the manners, will go a long way in demystifying and opening up doors and allowing people to see you beyond the surface. That being said, I've also experienced being stopped by cops. Which in my estimation, it is based off of my skin color. It is based off of me being a foreigner. It is based off of me being different. However, I've never had any hostile situations with cops out here. They've always been courteous. They've always been friendly. I mean, mind you, it is annoying and it can be triggering, especially, you just minding your business. You're not doing anything illegal. You're not doing anything wrong. And then you're just stopped by cops and they ask you questions like, do you have anything dangerous on you? Can I see your ID? You know what I mean? But it's a different approach and a different vibe than I would get in the States generally. And usually, by the time we're done having that interaction out here in Japan, like with the police and whatnot, they usually apologize or, they're very polite about it. Like, sorry for interrupting your day. You know what I mean? Still doesn't take away the feeling of being kind of targeted in a sense. But at least there's that. There's a certain level of courtesy. But again, I think fluency in the language, being open-minded, understanding how things work out here, go a long way. And I think depending on your style, for me, I got locks. I usually sport either a beard or a mustache. You know what I mean? I'm a Rasta, through and through in terms of like my lifestyle and how I live my life and how I see the world. But I also have, Buddhist sensibilities, and Christ consciousness, and I tap into a lot of spiritual and, quote unquote, esoteric knowledge. So my perception on things, I would say, isn't your average perception on things for most people, black or white, whatever your identifier is. So I say all this to just kind of give an update. It's been quite a while being here in Japan, and I still plan to stay here in Japan. I love it here. I enjoy my life here. And I think it's one of those things to where it's just about finding your rhythm, finding your groove, finding your community, and finding the best way to sustain yourself. And once those things happen, I think you're able to better live anywhere. And for me, Japan is that place. So I appreciate y'all. I hope y'all are enjoying your day or your night, whatever time you're seeing this. Wishing y'all love, peace, and I'll see you in the next one.